So welcome everybody. It's great to be here with Dr. Russell James and Jim Langley. For those who are new and as you trickle in, please feel free to introduce yourself, say hi in the chat, what organization you're with, where you're calling in from. We'd love to learn more about you. This is the first time these giants of our field are getting together, if I may say so. They're going to laugh, but and we're going to be talking about the power of asking versus telling. We feel that this is a topic that's widely applicable to our socioeconomic moment, but also applicable to our fundraising environment. And to those who are new to the Donor Participation Project, also welcome. We are a community of fundraisers. We get together every month and we co-create solutions to increase donor participation. And in that picture, fundraising and asking questions is a big component. So I'm not going to do justice to your introductions, Professor James and Jim. May I ask you to introduce yourself for a moment, give a brief overview of your career, and then we'll get into the actual program. Professor James first.
Sure. So I'm Russell James. I'm a professor at Texas Tech University, where I teach charitable financial planning, plan gifts, major gifts, that sort of thing. And my research is all about how to encourage generosity. I spent a number of years as a director of plan giving, also as a college president, focused largely on major gifts, capital campaigns. But for many years now, I focus just on the research side of things.
Lovely. It's great to have you. Every time we have you with us, you attract a whole lot of interest. We love your research. Hi, Jim.
Hi, everyone. I spent 30 years in higher education, 21 as a vice president, running big campaigns at major universities. For the past 14 years, I'm in my 14th year as a consultant, having the time of my life. And I think this topic today probably sums up the single most important lesson that I have learned across that span of time. And I'm just completely delighted to be with Russell.
Thanks, Jim.
Amazing. And we're going to share some of these stories with you because I know you both. I know those stories are amazing and people are going to love them. But first, we're going to start with a little bit of the science behind this, kind of to answer that question of why asking actually does work better than telling. Professor James, it's all yours.
Yeah, sure. So, of course, we start with the idea that asking can be more powerful because if we say something, well, a donor's just going to see that as a matter of opinion. But if we can get the donor to say something, then it becomes a matter of fact. It is reality. And so questions can be really powerful. But academic research points to another reason how questions can be powerful. This is actually called the question behavior effect, QBE. So the idea is this: suppose we ask a person to do some pro-social act, right? It might be donating, volunteering, giving blood, voting, recycling, whatever. Well, that requires a trade-off. If I pay the cost, I get the positive identity effects, right? I am the type of person who gives or volunteers or recycles. If I avoid the cost, then I get negative identity effects. I'm not that type of person. Now let's switch it. Instead, let's just ask a question. Let's ask the person to predict if they will act. Predicting the behavior also has those positive identity effects. It affirms, I am this type of person who gives or volunteers and so forth. But notice a prediction is free. It's not a contract. It requires no effort and there's no cost. So what happens? Well, people are less likely to actually act pro-socially than to predict they will act pro-socially. And of course, that's no surprise. Here's the surprise. Once people predict they will act, they then change their future behavior. They change it to match their prediction. So the result is that asking for the prediction first increases the pro-social behavior. Now, in experimental research, we see this with blood donations, volunteering, voting, recycling, but it also works with donations. One experiment asked for this prediction. If you were contacted by your high school or college and asked to donate money, would you do so? It turns out that asking this a few days before a fundraising request worked. The share of those donating to their college actually increased by half. Louis, let me share one other experiment. It asked a different question. It asked people how much they would hypothetically donate to a project. Asking this increased actual donations later. Gifts went up by 43% for a project that helped turtles. It went up for 25% for another one that helped elephants. So this just shows that people tend to change their behavior to match their predictions. And this relates to how we are asking questions. We're asking questions to lead to a positive prediction. We want to connect with the donor's history, their people, their values, and connect those with the cause or the organization or the project. So ultimately, we want to ask questions that help the donor to define a personally meaningful victory. And that will help increase the subsequent gift prediction. So Lewis, I could talk about the research all day long, but I'll stop there and maybe we can get some practical input from you or Jim.
Okay, so I mean, one practical conclusion is that you should fundraise for turtles over elephants, right?
Absolutely. That is exactly what you should have gotten out of that. Thank you, Lewis.
Jim, have you seen this pan out in practice, this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy effect?
Oh, many, many times. And I do want to talk then about the interview. That's what we're talking about, not just people winging it, but we're really talking about moving toward a structured interview. I like to call it a forensic interview, so that anyone who's representing your organization can be working from a template, so you can be scientific in terms of the way you're gathering information. We're not out there subjectively asking questions. But I want to preface some specific examples with the importance of attitude. So the word interview comes from the Old French meaning to see one another. If you want to get the most out of an interview, you don't approach it as an extractive exercise. You approach it with an open mind, with a kind heart, and with a desire to know the other person without agenda. And when you do that, you will learn so much more. If you come in with preconceived notions about what you want to extract, what you're hoping the person will say, if you listen selectively, oh, I'll only listen when they start to say something that's encouraging to me, you will not yield nearly as much from those interviews. And then I do want to reinforce what Russell said in citing the biggest interview exercise I was ever involved with, the student discovery exercise at Georgetown, in which we had hundreds of students interview over 7,000 alumni face-to-face over a three and a half year period of time. 7,000 face-to-face interviews, interpersonal, not done on electronic platforms. So it was a massive logistic exercise. The person who coordinated that was Matthew Lambert, who's now the vice president at William & Mary, and he's a Prince of a Fellow if you don't know him, and has done a great job in everything that he's done. So we started this, and what we learned in doing these interviews, and I'll share more in the Q&A, was how positively people responded to the question, what would you do if you had another day in the week besides being with family and doing your work? So when we got them into the projective side, when we started asking them what was still important for them to do in the rest of their lives, however long that may be, one, they enjoyed it. Two, they said they learned so much themselves. And then three, to Russell's point, it is those projections that we need to follow. They have just shown the light about where they want to go. And if we meet them there, come alongside them, wonderful things will happen. The last thing I'll say, and again, we'll work in lots of points in dialogically, is that one of the most stunning results of this survey is not just the information it yielded about what animates people's philanthropy and civic engagement, but the fact that so many unprompted wrote handwritten letters to me in which a powerful theme emerged, which was, I never felt more respected. By Georgetown in this case. You see, so you set the stage for philanthropy by going in as a genuine listener, by doing something that has been known over time, going back to simple societies, that when we meet one another, the relationship will get off on the right foot if there is some demonstration of respect. And I think perhaps always the case, but certainly in the modern world, where people are pulled in so many directions, there's nothing more respectful than genuine, unfiltered listening.
Thank you, Jim. That's amazing, and it resonates so much with some of what Professor James has written that I've read, having a good rationale for the interview. Right? There's also some other studies talking about the "but you are free" effect, the BYAF effect, which is when you communicate a sentence with that spirit, that gist, it immediately you get a better response, a better frame of mind. Like you are mentioning. So in the spirit of questions, and now that we're here with a good amount of our friends in fundraising, let me invite you to post in the chat. Have you practiced interviews in this way? Have you sensed that they failed because maybe they weren't structured enough? So it's not just, chats, but there was actually some type of format to it, or maybe they weren't framed in that way that Professor James was talking about, where they weren't predicting their future behavior. We'd love to hear about everybody's experiences with that. And we'll have a Q&A section at the end.
So if I could, Louis, could
yes.
I just interject quickly? So maybe we'll anticipate questions. If you try to do this electronically and send out, what are your values? Give us insight into your psyche to people who don't know you, who are nominally connected to your institution, you're not going to get a good response. So much of setting up a productive interview is establishing trust first. So when we set up interviews, we had a letter going from the president promising they wouldn't be solicited. You see, what we try to do is set the stage to be transparent, to preview, and then to promise how we would follow up. So just wanted to interject. You have to create conditions that cause people to feel safe and therefore be open with you.
Lovely. And maybe we have some conversation about that. I think that there may be an angle here to actually do this in a way that's not as effective, but is still somewhat more effective through more impersonal means. But obviously the golden standard is that one-on-one relationship, that major gift relationship, that planned giving conversation. And we have two world-class experts here. So I'd love to pick your brains a little bit about conversations that you had that started with this type of questioning, that led to planned gifts, that led to impactful transformational gifts to your institutions. Do you have a couple of examples that come to mind, either personal in the form of research?
Russell?
Sure. So let me, I guess since I'm the professor here, let me share some research results. So when it comes to planned gifts, large estate gifts have one thing that is highly common, and that is they come with instructions. You see, it's the instructions, it's the story that make the large gifts compelling. Now, this is not a new phenomenon. There was one study of wills from the 1800s. Charitable bequests had restrictions or instructions in 14% of small cash gifts, 58% of real estate or large gifts, and 70% of gifts of a large share of the entire estate. So the idea here is that these large gifts need to produce a specific, usually lasting impact. You see, that's the motivation for the size of the gift. And when we look at the numbers on legacy income, it is all about the size of the gifts, not the number of donors. The money comes almost entirely from extreme gifts. And so the idea is we can look at those identity connections to get a bequest gift to connect to their people, their values, and their history. But that only gets us to the pat on the head gift. It doesn't give us a reason for making a gift of a specific size. In other words, it doesn't motivate the large bequest gift over the small one. If we want to do that, we have to help the donor define a personally meaningful victory. This can begin with a question like, so tell me, what would you like to accomplish with your gift? Or have you ever thought about how you would like your gift to be used? You see, these questions can lead to conversations about impact. And it is those conversations that can lead us to the kinds of impact that come with price tags, that have reasons to give a specific amount. I might respond to that type of question if the donor isn't sure with, well, the reason I ask is this. I was working with another donor. You remind me of him, and you both have a real heart for this cause. And he decided to create a permanent endowment for a scholarship, lectureship, professorship, some part of operations. And then you describe the impact. And now this will come from a blank dollar gift in his will. And would that type of gift appeal to you? The donor's reactions can then guide the conversation, right? If that example gift is too large, the reaction is going to show us that. We can describe a smaller gift option. If that area of impact isn't compelling, the reaction is going to show that. So the idea is we want to help the donor construct a personally meaningful philanthropic victory. And that's sort of the goal when we're engaging in this form of appreciative inquiry, is to not just extract information, but to be that guiding sage who comes along to help that donor construct their personally meaningful philanthropic victory.
I love to think I love everything he just said, and the way he said it seemed perfect to me. I think about in helping people work with planned gifts, you're conducting an oral history. And the more time you take with that history, think about it unfolding in multiple interviews. Don't try to do everything at once, and really get the person to truly believe, and you have to be so convicted that you want to know their story, that you're going to take the time, and then out of that story, again, using Russell's phrase about a guide, a sage guide, you can then say, oh, I see a pattern, I see a theme. I've mentioned multiple times in multiple settings, the great compliment of my career is not being involved in the transfer of billions of dollars, but being asked multiple times to give eulogies at donors' funerals. Because out of a series of interviews, they came to feel that I knew them and I had helped them discover themselves. And this is what gifted frontline gift officers do, whether they're in planned giving or major giving or any kind of frontline work. But we have to take the time and show an interest and let that history unfold, as I said, in multiple interactions, and then listen for the powerful themes about what caused them to be philanthropic. What were the hard, searing, important lessons of their life? And then ultimately, what would they want to pass on of everything that their life gave them? What would they want to pass on to future generations? What would they boil that down to? One, when you engage in fundraising like this, it is of immense interest. You learn so much, you grow close to people, they grow close to you, and out of it comes that kind of, very significant giving that Russell is talking about. So think about that. And I also believe that there's techniques to be learned from very, very good interviewers and very, very good oral historians about how this information can be drawn forth.
And Louis, if I can just jump in with one other comment here, what really resonates about what Jim is saying is that some of you may know that part of our research here in the Texas Tech Neuroimaging Institute is we stick people in brain scanners and we have them make these charitable bequest decisions. And one of the things that we found is that the strongest predictor of whether or not a person was going to say, yes, I want to include that charity in my estate plan, was an area of brain activation that we called visualized autobiography. So this is an internal visualization with taking an outside view on oneself. Now you can find the same result just by, for example, other research that's been done with in-depth qualitative interviews, where it's actually the connection to the donor's life story that drives that gift in a will, rather than the latest thing that the charity is doing. So we see this in a number of different research methodologies that are just giving us exactly the same answer. And in fact, one last thing I'll share, when we were asking people about their interest in a gift and a will, one of the things that we found is that their interest in making that charitable gift in a will went up dramatically if we reference that as a gift to support a cause that's been important in my life. So that was kind of a magic phrase that we found whenever we attached that to any kind of a planned gift in our description. People's interest in making the gift went up dramatically. So if it was to support a cause that has been important in my life, what does that do? That triggers this life review process. Well, what causes have been important in my life? And that life review process is, from a neurological level, what predicts and precedes the decision to include a charitable gift in a will.
So interesting. Let's talk about other circumstances in which these principles may or may not still apply. Matt Friedman, let me look for his comment. I'll put it up on the screen for both of you. He has a question about whether this would apply to BIPOC communities. I often hear this as a question related to, would this apply to other cultures? So how universal do we think these principles are that we're talking about today? That need to feel seen and that connection.
I think people acting on what life has taught them to be most important is universal. I think the means or the institutions with which we identify, or the organizations or the causes we identify, will vary greatly according to where we began, what influences occurred in our life, what injustices. So for instance, during the pandemic, you saw people responding in terms of changed philanthropic behaviors. Those over 35 responded profoundly to food banks. So the testimony that we were able to gather from that had people saying, I could see the lines. So in other words, I had visual verification. It wasn't abstract. Nobody was trying to tell me. I could see it with my own eyes. And I realized it could be my friends, my families, my neighbors. It could be me in that line. Right? So it was highly evocative. For people under the age of 35, the cause that was so vivid and evocative that tapped into many people's psyche was Black Lives Matter. And I don't think people realize how successful that has been and how profound the killing of George Floyd was in terms of motivating people irrespective. Obviously, people in BIPOC communities were motivated, but it was highly motivating across all gender, identities, race, et cetera, et cetera. So something that is universally seen, that is universally affecting, can be a great trigger to philanthropy. All that tells me is the universality of this is these dramatic moments in our lives that change our attitudes, that motivate us to action, is a philanthropic constant.
Thank you. And we were talking about the power of asking versus telling. We kind of went into that maybe ultimate, more significant planned gifts that people make. Does this apply to other types of gifts that people make? Maybe smaller gifts or maybe large gifts, but that happen in the lifetime of the donor. Or even perhaps beyond philanthropy, in other types of relationships. Do you have a perspective on major gifts, on the major gifts impact of, the effect of these strategies? And I see by Professor James' look that I'm confused everybody here on the call.
Well, Louis, I will just say that I think it's important that we distinguish between different types of gifts, because sometimes fundraisers can get good at one type of gift, and they don't realize that those mechanisms don't work for another type of gift. So what I mean is that there are gifts that I might call the pat on the head gift, the isn't that nice for you people gift. This is the social compliance gift, right? These gifts tend to be relatively small compared to the donor's capacity. Okay, now that is important and useful for a lot of different reasons, but it is a different animal than the major life investment gift. you can get away with the message of, we're so fantastic. Let me tell you how fantastic our organization is, if all you want is the pat on the head gifts. But if you want those major life investment gifts, well, now you've got to start talking about a personally meaningful philanthropic victory that relates from that single gift. In other words, if the donor says, I made a gift, what changed? And if you can't answer that question, well, then that's in that realm of the pat on the head gifts. You're not in those major life investment gifts, because those kinds of gifts have to start with conversations about the philanthropic impact, not of the organization, but of that donor, and how that philanthropic impact is going to be visualizable and personally meaningful. So I don't know if that touches on your question or not, Lewis.
Yeah, I think many organizations don't realize how many pat on the head gifts they're getting, right? And so what we really want to look at are not the largest gifts, but large gifts within people's means. That's the major gift. That's a set of circumstances that cause someone to really act generously as a percentage of their net worth. That's what we'll learn from. And again, all my experience bears out what Russell is saying is that's where it comes from. I do think what I characterize as our pep rally school of fundraising yields those pat on the head gifts, right? And the conversation, the soulful, deep listening conversation, will start movement toward much more meaningful giving. The other thing I would watch out for, or at least tell you may be self-limiting, is the obligatory gift. And so if you focus on gratitude, or in the case of some faith-based fundraising, the faith itself is important, and you get the obligatory gift, it's not the self-actualizing gift that Russell and I are talking about. And that is the nexus that we're looking for, are gifts that are strategic for the institution seeking them and self-actualizing for the donor. And that more deliberate process always bears, in my experience, always bears much more significant giving.
Fantastic. So let's open up the portion of today's call for Q&As. And I'm going to start with a question that is totally speculative. I'm going to throw it at you. Feel free to throw it back at me if you don't like it. Which is, do we think that maybe this need for impact, this need for transformational giving, for meaning, is extending to more people who would otherwise have been satisfied with that pat on the head giving experience? So I'm coming at this from the perspective of the evident decline and people, there are less people giving to charities. Could a part of this be that they're not finding those experiences, those deeply meaningful experiences that you're both talking about, and they've started to expect them, whereas before they just maybe didn't, or they were, it was an environment where they thought, okay, this is what I get. I don't know, total speculation. Would welcome your thoughts, and I invite everybody here to start asking questions to overcome this really bad one.
So, Lewis, I'll just jump in and say, to the extent that these things have changed, one of the environmental changes is the presence of crowdfunding, sort of a disintermediation where we don't need that charitable organization to be able to go online and find someone where we can make a substantial impact. And so that could be an environmental change that, that there are this different level of expectations. But I will say that, we do see that large gifts come with instructions. We can go back 100 years, we can go back 200 years or more. And in fact, we can go back to Greek and Roman history. And what we see is that the substantial gifts of wealth do something specific. So I like to put it this way, Lewis, the idea is, I don't ask people for money. I ask people to do things that happen to cost money. And you see, there's a big difference there, because the pat on the head gift doesn't do anything specific. I'm not asking them to make a specific impact with that kind of a gift. It is much more compelling for me not to ask for money, but to ask for a person to do things that happen to cost money. And I think that's always going to be universally compelling, even though, yeah, I think there's more opportunities to do that these days that didn't exist a few decades ago.
Wonderful. So, great question from Rajashri. How to convert pat on the head donors to contributing to a passion donors?
That's why we're here. This is what listening is about. This is exactly why this topic is in front of you. So you've got to spend more time with them, and you've got to put natively curious people in front of them, and you've got to arm natively curious people with a structured template so that you can all learn from each other in conducting these interviews. Take the subjectivity out of it and start to come up with a set of interview questions that is predictive across the board, and across the board is coaxing of people. So it is part the structure of the interview, and it's also part of the character of the interviewer that puts people at ease and that makes them come forward. So the pat on the head donor may be a bit skeptical, may be tired of the schmooze and ambush school of fundraising. And so what you've got to do is come in and say, in so many words, in the way you conduct yourself, I'm serious. I'm truly interested. I don't have a short-term agenda. I want this to be a win-win. We want to work with you to find something that's strategic for us and self-actualizing, whatever language works for that person. And we have to adjust our language to who we're working with. But this is the process that will convert your pat on the head donor to a more donor who's much happier and therefore feeling fulfilled and therefore more likely to give much larger amounts. But again, I must stress, this won't happen overnight. They may look at you based on past experience. And so if we bail out too soon, if we get frustrated too quick, if we revert to the extractive, we're going to be right back where we are. Unfortunately, as is the case, as let's say in dating, people have had so many bad experiences. Unfortunately, when you come in, you often have to prove you're not the last one or two people they encountered and had bad experiences with.
Wise point.
And
Dr. Russell.
I'll just jump in to reiterate that process is working with the donor to define a personally meaningful victory, and we might use the blue sky question, if money were no object, if the sky was the limit, what kind of an impact would you like to have on this cause? Lots of other conversational ways that we can learn about and guide the donor to that personally meaningful victory. And then there's a second step in that, because once we've identified what is that compelling victory in that donor's story, then we have to think about how does that fit, or does that fit with our organization? And in fact, the key point at which you can change the relationship that fundraiser has is if there is something the donor wants to accomplish that doesn't fit into what your organization does, and you continue to be that guiding sage and say, well, here is a giving opportunity that's not with our organization that you might be interested in, because that then breaks that expectation that says, wait, I thought you were supposed to be the salesperson, the always be closing, hard selling person. You're actually helping me, even if it's not getting a gift for your organization. That can be really powerful. Of course, in many cases, there are going to be projects within the organization where we can, since we're an expert on the organization, match up that donor's personally meaningful victory with something that's specifically going on at our organization.
Louis, if I could just continue the dialogue but stop me, but also to cite the research, and I hope everyone's familiar with it, of Jen Cheng and Adrienne Sargent, and they're doing some deep listening focus groups with donors and learning a lot from them that they're sharing with us. So everybody interested in this topic, I think, will also benefit. But in the most recent study they did, they pointed out that many donors are in the act of self-discovery themselves. They haven't actually discovered fully who they are, and they're entering into philanthropy for that purpose. And again, to Russell's point, looking for that sage guide, that's really what they want. When we ask people what do they want in a fundraiser, and we give them multiple descriptors, we're struck by how often they choose the word facilitator. You see, they don't want the agenda. That's why they don't like the brochure, the leave behind, the pre-sell approach. They want to feel as if this is a true act of discovery and that you're working together on that. When they feel that that's genuine, then they will be open, very open. And there's wonderful comments being put in the chat box here, but among them include experienced fundraisers who will tell you, some donors, when they come to trust you, will give you astonishingly frank information about their financial wherewithal, where it is, what they're going to do with it, how much they're going to give to their family, et cetera, et cetera. So when trust comes into the interview, incredibly insightful information that you could never gather electronically because it's not always in public records is forthcoming from these donors. And I think many people have experienced that.
Let's talk about another vehicle that has grown tremendously and, in my assessment, driven by that need for trust or lack of trust, maybe on the other hand, right? How does the panel view DAFs, donor advised funds, in this talk on pat on the head versus impactful giving? Thoughts?
Russell?
Yeah, sure. So, the donor advised fund, it's just a mechanism, it's just a tool. Now, the advantage of the donor advised fund is that it actually breaks up that giving experience so that each step is less painful, and it also allows the donor to enjoy being philanthropic multiple times. What do I mean by that? Well, of course, the traditional is the donor writes a check, makes a gift, and they are philanthropic once. They give up the money and they make the gift. The donor advised fund, from a psychological perspective, makes each step easier because step number one, yes, I write the check, but I still control the money. So I'm philanthropic because look at what I put into my donor advised fund, but I still have control. So I'm not really giving up that much in that first step. Now, notice in the second step, I also get to be philanthropic because I am managing these charitable assets. And so I can think about how this is growing over time and remind myself of how philanthropic I am being. And then, of course, the third step, when I move the money out to actually make an impact, I'm being philanthropic for the third time, but it's not as painful because notice this isn't money that I could consume myself. This is money that's already been set aside for charitable purposes. And so we do see experimentally, whether it's with donor advised funds or the use of pledges, that if we can break this giving decision up into smaller pieces, each of which is less painful, and sort of expand that enjoyment of being philanthropic that the donor gets to experience, then we do increase the amount of giving that takes place. And I got to tell you, Lewis, that essentially the donor advised fund, it's something that we have seen being used for many, many, many decades. It's just that it used to be only available to the super rich, and it was called the Private Family Foundation. The thing that has caused so much conversation now is the democratization of the Private Family Foundation, where we're now saying, hey, everyone can use these kinds of instruments. Now, I'm not touching on the issues there where, yes, we do need to have some limitations that at some point that money needs to be paid out to the charitable organization. So I don't want to get into a legislative fight there. But from a research perspective, the psychology of these kinds of gifts is very powerful. I mean, think of it this way. If Bill Gates had just written one big check, would we have been reminded of how philanthropic Bill Gates has been over the last many years or decades? The fact that the giving is taking place this way expands the donor's philanthropic experience. So there is great potential in those things like private family foundations, like donor advised funds from a psychological perspective. But of course, there's also that potential for abuse if we don't get the legislative rules the right way.
The issue of DAFs has been clouded a little bit with some criticism that hasn't borne out. DAFs do show real philanthropic intent. The payouts suggest that people are acting philanthropically, not secreting the information. And of course, you can't claw it back. So at some point, you are going to have to give it away. So, it's a very positive sign in terms of philanthropic impulse. It's also troubling to many institutions is because most of that is being done year end, right? So people are moving money into DAFs year end, where I think instinctively they had a list of institutions or organizations that they favored. And that suggests that they're not happy with those choices and they want to give more thought. So while it's difficult to know where to meet them, do we know who's put money in DAFs? We can say they want more thought. And again, to the research being done by Shang and Sargent, there is the sense that they want more soulful experiences. They want to meet with beneficiaries. They want to see and feel the impact of philanthropy themselves. So now they're shopping. They've created a vehicle, and now they're sort of doing their own research and looking around. One simple tool would be to make DAF giving in whatever web presence you have. And Louis, you may know better how to do that, but I'm told you can sort of say, if you want to give through a DAF, here's the option. Now, with that, you're going to get a pat on the head gift, but then if anybody sends money to you through a DAF, if you set up that corridor, what's the most important thing to do? Follow up immediately with the interview that says, can you tell us why you chose us? Can we talk about working together more closely? You seize on anything that comes your way to deepen the relationship through active listening.
Sounds very smart. Let me keep going. We have some fantastic questions from a very accomplished audience today. Sandy has a question. She's saying, aren't these large, meaningful gifts usually designated rather than unrestricted general support? My org is talking about creating or allowing designated giving now. We think we're missing a lot. I know the group here has strong views on this.
So let me jump in because just last year we had a really cool study by Case looking at the largest gifts coming to universities, colleges at all levels. So different size gifts for community colleges as compared to research universities, but for each institution they were looking at those very large gifts. And by the way, those very large gifts are important because in a university or college fundraising space, we don't live in an 80-20 world. We actually live in something closer to an 82 world, where 2 to 3% of donors are actually generating 80% of the gifts. And the fascinating thing about this study of the largest gifts, over 1,000 of them, was that of those gifts, only 14% included even a single dollar that was unrestricted. Now, that doesn't mean 14% of the gifts were unrestricted. It means only 14% of those large gifts included anything at all that was unrestricted. So we have to get creative as fundraisers to understand this is motivational for donors. How do we bridge that gap between the organizational goals and accomplishing something for donors? And there are some different ways we can approach that. Obviously, if we've got a budget, we can convert that budget into a series of restricted gift opportunities, because essentially it makes that restricted gift fungible. That now, okay, well, we're covering this part of the budget, so we can begin that way. You can also think about doing gift restrictions in a story restricted kind of way. So for example, if a donor cares about a particular area of operations, we can talk about, well, this area of operations for us to, the the cost to do this program for a week is X dollars. I'd like to talk to you about sponsoring this activity for a week. This is what it costs for a week. This would cover a month. This covers a year. And this would be an endowed gift to permanently endow the program. So notice what I'm doing there. I can actually share a gift restriction, but it includes all those parts of the operation. I'm using that per diem argument where now as a donor, I can visualize, oh, for that entire period of time, all of that impact that's being made that you can tell me stories about, that I know what's going to be happening. That is the work that I specifically am paying for. So again, there are these ways where we can bridge this gap between what the organizational goals are and allowing the donor to make that personally meaningful philanthropic victory that actually accomplishes something.
So true. I run into so many clients, so many people who treat it as an either or. What Russell is suggesting is exactly right, maybe worthy of a whole session itself, is there is a nexus to be had there. It can be done. And so let's get out of that either or school. To Sandy, I would say you absolutely must, Sandy, for the good of your cause. You are missing a lot. A good 15 years ago, Penelope Burke's research showed the single greatest reason for donor loss was being asked too often and only being asked to give unrestricted. So when you don't give people a chance to exercise choice, they go to places where they can. For all the reasons that we've mentioned, is there are deeper motivations they have that they're not seeing in the choices that we're giving them, right? So you've got to do that. Now, again, research shows that when you come alongside people and meet them where they are and talk about acting out of their value systems, and you build trust with them over time, they become more responsive to your core strategic needs. They soften their ego, their story, to meet you in a middle place. But that has to be earned over time. You see, we come at them with, this is how we want you to behave, as opposed to how might we work together, and by working together, find more mutuality of purpose.
And we'll both be changed, right? Which is what
Yes.
I often see in clients. Small reflection on Sandy's question, which is, I've seen that we often, or we as in nonprofits, often trying to project our financial structure on the nonprofit. So yes, we have restricted and unrestricted accounts. They don't care. They care about gifts that have meaning and that that allow them to tell the story that matches their identity, their values, that allows them to see themselves as the the ideal people that they are. So there's another question here, and I'm going to take a stab of it with permission from
Please.
Dr. James and Jim. Can you automate these principles or apply them on a larger scale before we get to a deeper relationship or a visit? Jim just shared one way to do this, which is, yes, you can use more automated, broad-based methods as a way to identify people, to pull into these types of more one-on-one, deeper conversations. You can do, I do this very often. You can set up automation processes so that you don't have to remember to do this all the time, so that it's not, John at the front desk that has to be looking at the gift roll every single day to see if there's a gift from a DAF. So you take that out. And to some extent, I see the evolution of mass communication as pushing down some of these principles that we've learned about today into the relationship with as many people as possible. So instead of sending appeals, would you think about sending surveys, as a fundraising tool? Would you incorporate that? With survey being kind of an interview at scale, not as effective. We've talked about that. You're never going to receive a transformational multi-million-dollar check from that, but you might start a relationship that takes you there.
That's right.
So that's my angle on this. I don't know if you gentlemen have a different perspective.
So yeah, I would agree with you. There are now tools where at the level of donor that may not justify the one-on-one personal interaction in terms of cost, or at least we don't know if it's justified or not. that there are some technology options that allow us to ask questions at scale and to respond, at least in an initial way, to some of those questions. So in the old school frame, we can think about this as the survey instrument, but that survey instrument, that's now from a digital perspective, it can be highly fragmented, highly personalized. It can actually be multiple journeys that can happen depending upon where a person or at their digital body language, what parts of the website they're connecting to. So I think these things are becoming more and more possible, up to the point where, Lewis, I think pretty soon we'll all just be replaced by Chat GPT, right?
I kind of hate that. I've seen people being excited about having a Chat GPT fundraiser bot on a nonprofit website, and I'm still not feeling it. I hope it augments us and it lets us get a chat Dr. James and chat Langley, so that I can be in your brain for a while every day. But I hope that to be a human augmentation tool. But anyhow, my 2 cents.
Louis, I think the secret may be, just building on what both of you have said, is to keep this a running dialogue. So if you do one survey, you want to have it on your web saying, according to the first 200 people responded, 73% feel this way. What do you think? You see, you keep playing back, you've heard what you've learned, and you invite more people into the conversation. What Louis and I are talking about is, say in a traditional campaign, you have this initial study, you have one fixed period of listening that's supposed to last for 7 or 10 years. Louis and I together are saying, no, modern fundraising, modern campaigning is constant intake of field intelligence, constant sharing of what you're learning, and then inviting more and more people into the conversation to see if the weighting of those findings starts to shift with the volume received.
Something like that. Let me put up a graphic for us to comment, but essentially turning the campaign cycle into a shorter a combination of shorter cycles that follow surveying, mirroring, which is kind of what Jim was saying, reflecting back, engaging around the topics, and then asking. So not to go deeper into that today, but that's kind of the idea. The perennial people don't want to meet with me question, which is, according to all the surveys I've read, increasingly difficult to get people to sit down with a gift officer, maybe because that trust has been broken so many times before. And maybe because now people have better alternatives to find out information about a nonprofit. They're not kind of hostage in the way. If I want to hear about the hospital's research, I have to sit down with a gift officer. That's no longer the case. Recommendations here for Jane?
So I'll jump in with a few. I mean, before we start in with questions, we've got to justify asking those questions. What are some reasons that would justify that? There's a category that is, I need your help or advice. Why do I need your help or advice? Maybe because I'm new here. Maybe because we have a problem. Maybe because we have an idea. Maybe it's just the idea that you're in charge or that you're important, so we need to know. Now, the reverse of this is to say, I can help or advise you, that is my role, is to help donors plan out their gifts to make a personally meaningful, lasting impact. Another is very straightforward. It's just I'm interested in your story. So the idea is we want to have a reason to ask the questions. Now, it's really important that we not follow up, whether it's a survey or a question asking, with any kind of an ask for money. We need to separate those things, because otherwise it's going to delegitimize those questions, that you didn't really want my advice, you just wanted to ask for money. And so,
switcheroo.
What's that?
The technical term is the old switcheroo.
Right. And also in that same category, don't ever ask a question like, should we continue our award-winning work that is transforming the lives of so many in desperate need? That is not legitimate. You don't care what the person thinks. But, so sometimes we can ask questions because of who the person is. Your insight is especially important because we need input from women or baby boomers or loyal donors or alumni from the 80s or people who care about blank. So again, the idea is that we're connecting in with the donor's identity. We need their help because of who they are. So those are just a few examples of how we might open up a conversation by saying, I'm interested in your story. I need your help or advice, or I can help or advise you.
So the analogy I use, it's like a church. And so if the person is a new prospect and has no affiliation with your church, you don't send somebody out with an offering basket to bring them to the church. They go, well, I know this is what this is about. I don't know if I ascribe to this faith. I don't know if I like the minister. I don't know if I want to hang out with the congregants. So what are you coming to me? If I'm a former donor, or let's say an alumnus of 25 years who you haven't paid any attention to, it's like showing up at my door one evening with an offering basket from a church I attended 25 years ago and saying, but don't you want to give? Well, no, I've been, it's been 25 years. I've gotten involved in other things. Or here's $5, go away and leave me alone, right? So you have to then say, how do you get people to cross the mission threshold, to see what you're doing, to see what your mission is, what you aspire to do, to experience the place, to meet other congregants or cause-oriented people, to see, is this my community? Is this my family? Is this where I want to be? And so we've got to do much better at experiential engagement. I love Russell's questions. And I would say then what I would do is, if I had no other choice, is to say, have our president announce, we are trying to learn much more from current and prospective constituents. We want to see if we're serving. We're going to be conducting a massive poll every way we can, listening to everybody we can. And so if you receive any outreach, please know this is the context. Then if I don't have that, I'm going to pick up on Russell's advice and say something to the effect of, I don't want an appointment, but I'd love to ask you 3 questions. I'd appreciate doing this interpersonally. Here are the 3 questions I would love to discuss. The more we preview, the more safe people come, because again, it's bad experience that's causing them to screen out people with offering baskets. It's so clear what you want. So we ask permission and we preview. And if you say, okay, if it's not convenient to meet either on a virtual platform or interpersonally, we really value your candid opinion to these 3 questions. And those questions, as Russell suggested, have to look like they're soul searching, not setting you up for only one response. What could we do better in your estimation? And then watch what pours in.
Thank you to both of you. We're nearing the end of the hour. We know everybody is quite busy. I'm going to put up a slide so that people feel like they have good information to continue this conversation. Maybe with you, Jim, with you, Dr. James, if you'd like to connect with me or check out this group that we have going. Since we have 1 more minute and there were so many fantastic questions today, I'm going to put one up by Shweta, and we might discuss this as we close the meeting. So talking about the ROI of this. So the amount of resources required to achieve any amount of perceivable results is huge in terms of manpower, networking, and others. What's your take on this? So from an organization that hasn't seen the impact of this, it can seem overwhelming, and it's an ROI that might seem unachievable. Some words of faith, some data to back up the true impact of these strategies?
I would just quickly say you've got a lot of resources at your disposal that you're not using. You have staff that can be trained how to interview. You have volunteers. You have board members. If you're handing everything off to advancement and saying discover everything through that channel, you're already self-limiting. Be more creative about the ways you can listen, and look at every channel that you're now using to communicate one way and ask, how can you make it 2-way?
Yeah, that's great. Let me jump in to say, yes, thanks for putting that slide up, Lewis. Do connect with me on LinkedIn. I share all my stuff for free. I respond with a ridiculously long message that gives free links to all of my books and videos and slide sets and all of that. But on this, I think at a certain point, we've got to recognize empirical reality. And that empirical reality is that if you want the resources to actually make the impact, that's not going to come from 100 or 1,000 pat on the head gifts. And what that means is that fundamentally, there is nothing that has a better ROI than spending more time with the donors of capacity who care about your cause. And that is where these major organizationally transformational gifts can come from. There's lots of great reasons to try to expand the volume of donors, but the number one is because we want that to help us identify those who have the willingness, the interest, and the capacity to make these major transformational gifts, because that's where those kinds of gifts come from that can pay for the amount of resources it takes to really make an impact for these causes.
Thank you so much to both of you. Quick plug, Shweta, there's going to be a donor participation project session by a past vice president of development at an institution called Dalhousie University in Canada, talking about investment in advancement. I believe, Jim, you're familiar with this research. And the facts are just out there. It's very clear. It pays off better than anything, really. So thanks both.
Thank you, Louis.
Jim and Dr. James, and we'll see you soon, we hope.